I woke up from a coma 3 days after a devastating car accident, but nobody knew it. My body still wouldn't respond. My eyes remained closed, and I couldn't speak. Yet I could hear everything happening around me. At first, I thought I was lucky to be alive. Then I heard my own children talking about me, and I quickly realized something was very wrong. The accident happened on my way home from a company event. For nearly 4 decades, I had built Harrison Logistics from a single truck into a multi-million-dollar business. It wasn't just a company, it was my life's work. Every long day, every missed vacation, every sacrifice had gone into creating something I hoped would one day belong to my family. The first voice I recognized was my son Michael's. "How much longer is this going to take?" he asked. A doctor replied, "Your father is showing encouraging signs. His brain activity has improved significantly." I expected relief. Instead, the room became quiet. Then my daughter Sarah spoke. "So he could wake up soon?" "Yes," the doctor answered. "There's a real possibility." My son let out a frustrated sigh. "That's a problem." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. The doctor sounded confused. "What do you mean?" Michael quickly changed his tone. "I just mean, seeing him like this is difficult." A few minutes later, the doctor left the room. The moment the door closed, everything changed. "Everything was supposed to be finalized next week," Sarah whispered. "I know," Michael replied. "If Dad wakes up before then, the entire deal could fall apart." My pulse started racing. What deal? What were they talking about? Then Sarah asked the question that made my blood run cold. "Do you think he knows anything?" Michael laughed quietly. "He's in a coma. What could he possibly know?" For years, I had trusted my children with almost everything. Michael had access to company records. Sarah handled several important accounts. I believed they were preparing to continue my legacy. Now I wasn't so sure. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. Lawyers, documents, transfers, deadlines. The more they talked, the clearer it became that something was happening behind my back. Something involving my company. Something they desperately didn't want me to discover. Right before we continue, take a second to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because what I learned over the next 7 days completely destroyed my family. I wanted to open my eyes and confront them immediately. I wanted answers. But years in business had taught me one important lesson. People reveal the truth when they believe you're powerless. So I stayed still. I pretended to remain unconscious. Over the next week, nurses came and went. Doctors checked my condition. Friends visited and wished me well. And by the end of the week, I discovered they weren't just planning to take control of my company. They were planning to take everything. And they had no idea I was listening. I spent the next 7 days pretending to be unconscious. It wasn't easy. Every instinct told me to open my eyes and demand answers. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that staying silent was my only advantage. My children visited almost every day. At first they spoke carefully whenever nurses were around, but once they believed they were alone, their conversations became far more revealing. On the second day, Michael walked into my hospital room carrying a folder. "We're close," he told Sarah. "The board meeting is scheduled for Friday. What if Dad wakes up before then?" she asked. "He won't," Michael replied confidently. "And even if he does, he'll be too weak to stop anything." I felt anger building inside me. For 40 years, I had built that company. I had survived recessions, lawsuits, and competitors who wanted to destroy everything I'd created. Yet the people trying to take it from me weren't strangers. They were my own children. The next morning, an old friend named Robert came to visit. Robert had served as the company's attorney for nearly 20 years. When he entered the room, I heard him speaking quietly with my son outside the door. Has your father ever signed anything regarding a leadership transfer? Robert asked. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Michael answered, Not officially. Robert's voice immediately changed. Then I suggest you stop acting like the company already belongs to you. For the first time all week, I heard uncertainty in my son's voice. That conversation stayed in my head long after they left, because it confirmed something important. Whatever Michael and Sarah were planning, it wasn't completely legal. Later that evening, Sarah visited alone. She sat beside my bed for nearly an hour talking on her phone. She thought I was unconscious, so she never lowered her voice. That's when I heard a name I recognized. Daniel Mercer, my biggest competitor. The same man who had spent years trying to buy my company. The same man I had repeatedly refused. My heart nearly stopped. Why was my daughter speaking with him? Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Once the transfer is complete, we'll sell immediately. Sell? My entire company? The business I had spent my life building? I suddenly understood why they were in such a hurry. This wasn't about running the company. It was about cashing out. They weren't trying to protect my legacy. They were trying to liquidate it. As Sarah ended the call, she laughed softly and said something I'll never forget. Dad would have never agreed to this. She was right. I never would have. And that's exactly why they were waiting for me to stay silent. What they didn't know was that I already had a plan. Because the following morning, a nurse walked into my room with news that changed everything. And the second I heard it, I knew my children had made a very serious mistake. The next morning, I was awakened by two nurses discussing paperwork near my bed. Most of it sounded routine until one of them mentioned that a representative from Harrison Logistics had called the hospital asking about my condition. That caught my attention immediately. Not because it was unusual, because I knew exactly who hadn't made that call. Michael. If he had called, he would have contacted my personal doctor directly. He had those numbers. Instead, someone else from the company was trying to get information. A few hours later, I got my answer. Robert arrived. The moment he entered the room, he asked the nurse for privacy. Once we were alone, he pulled a chair beside my bed and began speaking. I know you can hear me. For a second, I nearly opened my eyes. Robert chuckled softly. Relax. The nurse told me you've been responding to certain sounds. I stayed still. Then he lowered his voice. Your children are planning something. My pulse immediately increased. Robert continued. They've been pressuring the board to approve a temporary leadership transfer. So I wasn't imagining it. Everything I had overheard was real. But that's not the worst part, Robert said. The room suddenly felt colder. I discovered they're negotiating with Mercer Holdings. Daniel Mercer, the same competitor who had spent years trying to acquire my company. Robert let out a frustrated sigh. Michael thinks he's making a brilliant business deal. What he doesn't understand is that Mercer isn't buying the company because it's valuable. I already knew where this was going. Mercer wanted the contracts, the assets, the client network. After that, he'd strip everything else apart. Thousands of employees would lose their jobs. 40 years of work would disappear. And my children were helping him do it. Robert stood up and placed something on the bedside table. I've delayed the board meeting by 48 hours. 48 hours. That wasn't much time, but it was enough. As he walked toward the door, he stopped and looked back. One more thing. His voice became serious. There's someone else involved. My stomach tightened. Your daughter isn't just talking to Mercer. A long silence followed. Then Robert said the last thing I expected to hear. She's engaged to one of his executives. I couldn't believe it. Sarah had secretly been working with the very people trying to take my company. Suddenly, everything made sense. The urgency, the secrecy, the phone calls. This had been planned for months. maybe longer. The door closed behind Robert, leaving me alone with a truth that hurt more than the accident itself. My children weren't making a mistake. They were making a choice, and they had chosen money over family. But what neither of them knew was that my recovery was happening much faster than the doctors expected, because later that evening, I moved my hand for the first time. And when I saw the nurse's reaction, I realized I finally had a way to stop them. That evening, I moved my hand for the first time. It wasn't much, just a slight movement of my fingers. But the nurse noticed immediately. "You saw that, right?" she asked another nurse. The second nurse nodded. For the first time since the accident, I felt hope. Real hope. The doctors were called in, and over the next hour, they performed several tests. I still pretended to be weaker than I actually was, but their reactions told me everything I needed to know. My recovery was progressing quickly, much quicker than anyone expected. And if the doctors knew it, it wouldn't be long before my children found out too. The next day, Michael arrived alone. He walked into the room carrying his laptop and immediately started making phone calls. As usual, he assumed I couldn't hear him. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning," he said. "Once the vote happens, everything becomes much easier." He listened for a few seconds. Then his voice lowered. "No, Dad isn't a problem. The doctors still don't think he'll be functional anytime soon." I almost laughed. The confidence in his voice was unbelievable. For someone planning to take over a company, he had done very little research about the man who built it. After ending the call, he sat beside my bed and started talking. At first, I thought he was finally going to apologize. "I was wrong. You should have retired years ago," he said quietly. The room fell silent. "I spent my whole life waiting for my chance, and you never trusted me enough to step aside." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about money. It was resentment. Years of resentment. Michael wasn't trying to save the company. He was trying to take something he believed he deserved. Before leaving, he said one final thing. "Tomorrow everything changes." Then he walked out. What he didn't know was that something had already changed. Me. Later that afternoon, Robert returned. This time, I opened my eyes. The look on his face was priceless. For a second, he just stared. Then he laughed. I knew it. My voice was weak, but it worked. "How long do we have?" His expression immediately became serious. "Less than 24 hours. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the bed. Inside were emails, contracts, and meeting records. Evidence. A lot of evidence. The more I read, the worse it became. Michael and Sarah had already promised Mercer access to company assets before any legal approval existed. They were negotiating deals they had no authority to negotiate. In some cases, they had even signed preliminary agreements using company resources. The situation was worse than betrayal. It was corporate fraud. I looked up at Robert. "What happens if the board sees this?" He smiled. "They'll remove both of them immediately." For the first time since the accident, I felt completely calm. Tomorrow morning, my children expected to take my company. Instead, they were about to walk into the biggest mistake of their lives, and they still had no idea I was awake. The next morning, Michael and Sarah walked into the boardroom, believing they were about to take control of everything I had spent 40 years building. Neither of them knew I was awake, and neither of them expected to see me. According to Robert, the meeting started exactly as planned. Michael stood at the front of the room, presenting himself as the company's future leader. Sarah sat beside him while several board members reviewed documents, supporting a temporary transfer of authority. For the first 30 minutes, everything went their way. Then Robert walked in. He wasn't alone. I was right behind him. The moment I entered the room, every conversation stopped. One board member nearly dropped his coffee. Sarah's face turned completely white. Michael looked like he'd seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Michael stood up. "Dad?" I smiled. "Good morning." The room remained silent. You could practically feel the panic spreading across their faces. Michael recovered first. You're awake." Clearly, his eyes immediately shifted toward Robert, then toward the stack of documents in front of me. That's when he realized something was wrong. Very wrong. I slowly took my seat at the head of the table. The same seat I had occupied for nearly 4 decades. The same seat my son thought he was about to inherit. "I understand you've been making important decisions on behalf of this company," I said calmly. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked at Michael. Robert then distributed copies of the evidence to every board member. Emails, contracts, private communications with Mercer Holdings, unauthorized negotiations. The room became quieter with every page they read. One director shook his head in disbelief. Another looked genuinely angry. Sarah lowered her eyes and refused to look at anyone. Michael tried to speak. "Let me explain." "No," one board member interrupted. "You explain why you are negotiating the sale of company assets without authorization." Another director slammed a document onto the table. "You signed agreements you had no legal authority to sign." Michael's confidence disappeared almost instantly. The board spent the next hour reviewing everything. By the end of it, the decision was unanimous. Michael and Sarah were removed from all leadership positions, effective immediately. Every access privilege was revoked. Every pending agreement was canceled. Every negotiation with Mercer Holdings was terminated. Just like that, their plan collapsed. But the meeting wasn't over, because as everyone prepared to leave, Robert handed me one final document. A document I hadn't seen before. I looked down at the first page, then read the second. My stomach tightened, because hidden among all the evidence was something even worse than I expected. Something that proved this betrayal hadn't started after my accident. It had started months earlier, and when I discovered who came up with the original plan, I was more shocked than anyone else in that room. I stared at the document for several seconds, hoping I had misunderstood what I was reading. I hadn't. I slowly looked up from the papers and toward my children. Michael couldn't even meet my eyes. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. The boardroom was completely silent. Who started this? I asked. Nobody answered. I asked again. Who came up with the idea? Finally, Sarah spoke. It wasn't Michael. The room immediately turned toward her. My son looked shocked, almost nervous. Then Sarah lowered her head and quietly said the last thing I expected to hear. It was Mom. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier. The woman who helped me build the company. The woman who knew exactly how much that business meant to me. I stared at Sarah in disbelief. What are you talking about? Tears appeared in her eyes. Mom met with us before she died. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sarah continued. She told us she was worried about you. She thought you'd never retire. She thought the company had become your entire identity. I listened carefully, because something about the story didn't feel right. My wife knew me better than anyone. She would have encouraged retirement, but she would have never encouraged betrayal. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. I didn't want to show you this. My heart immediately sank. The envelope had my wife's handwriting on it. I would have recognized it anywhere. Robert handed it to me. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter written only months before her death. The room remained silent while I read. Halfway through, I stopped. Then I read it again, because the letter wasn't what my children thought it was. Not even close. Slowly, I looked up. Michael seemed confused. Sarah looked terrified. I placed the letter on the table. Then I asked a simple question. Did either of you actually read the entire thing? The silence told me everything. They hadn't. Sarah had only read part of it. Michael had apparently never read it at all. I almost laughed, because suddenly the whole situation made sense. For 8 months, they had convinced themselves they were following their mother's wishes. But they had ignored the most important part. The final page. I held up the letter. Your mother never told you to sell the company. Both of them froze. I turned to the last page and read aloud. If my husband ever decides to step away from Harrison Logistics, that decision must be his and his alone. The company represents his life's work, and nobody, not even our children, has the right to take that choice away from him. The room went silent. Michael's face lost all color. Sarah started crying, because in one sentence, their entire justification disappeared. But the letter wasn't finished. There was still one final paragraph. And when I read it, I finally understood what my wife had really been trying to protect all those years. The room was so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning humming above us. Sarah sat with tears running down her face. Michael looked completely stunned. For months, maybe even years, they had convinced themselves they were carrying out their mother's wishes. Now they were discovering they had built that belief on half a letter and a lot of assumptions. I looked back down at the page and continued reading. The final paragraph wasn't about the company. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about retirement. It was about family. Your mother had written, if you're reading this after I'm gone, I want you to remember something. Businesses can be rebuilt. Money can be earned again. But trust, once broken, is much harder to repair. Don't let greed convince you that success is more important than the people who love you. Nobody spoke. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. For the first time since the accident, I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. And somehow that felt worse. Michael finally broke the silence. Dad, we thought. No, I interrupted calmly. You assumed. His head dropped immediately. Because he knew I was right. The board members remained seated, watching everything unfold. This wasn't just a corporate meeting anymore. It was a family reckoning. Sarah wiped her eyes. We never wanted to hurt you. I looked at her for a long moment. Then why hide it? Neither of them answered. Because there wasn't a good answer. If they truly believed they were doing the right thing, they wouldn't have needed secret meetings, hidden negotiations, and private agreements. They would have talked to me. They didn't, and deep down, they knew exactly why. Robert leaned forward and placed another document in front of me. This arrived yesterday. I frowned. What is it? A proposal for Mercer Holdings. I opened it. The moment I read the first page, I understood everything. Mercer had never intended to keep Harrison Logistics operating. His plan was to acquire the company, sell the assets, terminate hundreds of employees, and absorb the remaining contracts into his own organization. Thousands of families would have been affected. People who had worked beside me for decades. People who trusted me. And my children had almost helped make it happen. Michael stared at the table. I didn't know. I believe you, I said. And surprisingly, I did. Because Michael's mistake wasn't malice. It was greed mixed with arrogance. He had been so focused on what he could gain that he never stopped to ask who might lose. Sarah looked at me through tears. Can you ever forgive us? The question hung in the room. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then I stood up slowly. I looked at my children, then at the board members, then at the letter your mother had left behind. And that's when I made a decision that nobody in that room expected. A decision that would determine the future of my family and the future of the company And when I announced it, even Robert looked shocked. I stood up slowly and looked around the boardroom. Every eye was on me. My children looked terrified. The board members were waiting for a decision. Robert sat quietly beside me, probably expecting me to remove Michael and Sarah from the company permanently. Honestly, a week earlier, that's exactly what I would have done. I took a deep breath. Then I made my decision. Michael and Sarah will not inherit Harrison Logistics. The room immediately became silent. Michael closed his eyes. Sarah started crying again. But I wasn't finished. At least not yet. Both of them looked up, confused. The board members exchanged glances. I continued. For the next 5 years, neither of you will hold executive authority. Neither of you will sit on this board. Neither of you will make decisions affecting this company. Michael looked devastated, but he listened, because for once, he had no choice. Instead, I said, you'll start where every employee starts. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? Means you'll earn your place. Nobody spoke. I looked directly at my son. You want to run a logistics company? Then spend time with the drivers. Then I turned to Sarah. You want to make decisions affecting employees? Then work beside them. The room stayed silent, because everyone understood what I was really saying. For years, my children had only seen the top floor, the offices, the profits, the power. They had never understood the people who actually made the company work. Right here, everything changed. Michael slowly shook his head. You want us to start from the bottom? Exactly. The board members were trying not to smile. Several of them had started the same way decades earlier. One director finally spoke. Honestly, that's probably the smartest thing we could do. Others nodded. For the first time all morning, there was agreement in the room. Then I made my second announcement, the one nobody expected. I picked up my wife's letter. As for me, the room became quiet again. I am retiring. Robert nearly dropped his pen. Michael stared. Sarah looked shocked. After everything that had happened, nobody expected those words. But your mother had been right. The company had become too much of my identity. I had spent 40 years building it. Maybe it was finally time to trust others to help carry it forward. Not because I was forced to, because I chose to. I looked at my children. Over the next 5 years, you'll have an opportunity to prove you deserve a future here. A long silence followed. Then Michael stood up. Dad, his voice cracked. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't thinking about money, or ownership, or power. He looked like a son again. And that's when I realized something. The accident may have nearly destroyed my family, but it had also exposed everything that needed to be fixed. And what happened 6 months later proved that people can change when they're finally forced to face themselves. 6 months later, I barely recognized my children. Not because they looked different, because they acted different. The first few weeks had been rough. Michael hated starting over. He went from attending executive meetings to riding, along with delivery drivers before sunrise. They were just employees. And honestly, that was exactly what they needed. Every few weeks, Robert would give me updates. At first, the reports weren't encouraging. Michael argued with supervisors. Sarah complained about long hours. More than once, both of them considered quitting. But something changed around the 3rd month. Instead of fighting the process, they started learning from it. Michael began spending extra time with warehouse staff. He discovered how difficult logistics operations really were. Delayed shipments, equipment failures, customer demands problems he had never seen from an executive office. Sarah changed too. One afternoon, she personally helped a long time client solve a major contract, issue that would have cost the company thousands of dollars. The client later sent a letter praising her professionalism. When Robert showed me that letter, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because she succeeded, because she earned it. Meanwhile, I was learning something myself. Retirement wasn't as terrible as I'd feared. For years, I believed stepping away from the company meant losing purpose. Instead, I found myself spending more time with old friends, traveling, and doing things I hadn't had time for in decades. One evening, Michael unexpectedly showed up at my house. No expensive suit, no executive attitude, just jeans, work boots, and exhaustion. He looked older, humbler, more honest. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset for a while, before he finally spoke. You know what surprised me most? What? Nobody cares who your father is when a truck breaks down in the middle of nowhere. I laughed. He laughed too. Then his expression became serious. I spent years thinking I understood the company. He shook his head. I didn't understand anything. For the first time, I believed him. A few days later, Sarah visited as well. She brought dinner and stayed for hours. We talked about Mom, old family vacations, and memories we hadn't discussed in years. Eventually, she looked at me and asked something that caught me off guard. Do you think Mom would be disappointed in us? I thought about it carefully. Then I smiled. No, she looked surprised. Why not? Because your mother always believed people could become better. Tears filled her eyes. And in that moment, I knew the healing had finally begun. But neither of us knew that a much bigger surprise was waiting. Because the annual shareholder meeting was only 2 weeks away. And during that meeting, Michael and Sarah were about to learn something I had kept secret from everyone. Something their mother had arranged years before she died. And when they discovered it, both of them were left speechless. 2 weeks later, the annual shareholder meeting took place. For the first time in 40 years, I sat as a guest, not the boss. The company was thriving without me, and honestly, I felt proud. Michael and Sarah were there too, sitting with department managers, exactly where they now belonged. 6 months ago, they thought leadership was inherited. Now they knew it was earned. As routine business wrapped up, Robert stood up. I have one final item. The room went quiet. Michael and Sarah exchanged confused glances. Robert opened a folder. This matter concerns a document left by Helen Harrison. Hearing my late wife's name made my heart tighten. Michael and Sarah sat up straighter. 10 years ago, Helen established a private family trust, Robert announced. Only Helen and Mr. Harrison knew it existed. The room buzzed. Robert revealed the figure. The trust was worth over $32 million. Gasps echoed through the room. Michael stared in disbelief. Sarah was stunned. But the real shocker wasn't the money. It was the catch. Helen included one condition, Robert read. The trust shall only be distributed when my children demonstrate integrity, humility, and a commitment to family above personal gain. If greed comes before character, it remains locked. Total silence. Everyone realized Helen hadn't been protecting the money. She was protecting her children. Sarah began to weep. Michael stared down, speechless. Robert closed the folder with a smile. After reviewing the past 6 months, the trustees unanimously agree. Helen's condition has been met. The room erupted into applause. It wasn't about the money. It was about growth, forgiveness, and a second chance. Michael walked over and hugged me, something he hadn't done in years. Sarah joined us, tears in her eyes. Standing there, we felt Helen's guiding presence. Money can be remade. Businesses can be rebuilt. But family only survives when you choose each other over selfish ambition. And thanks to her, we finally did.